Howdy, folks. Welcome back. This is Chance here with Brady at Apocalypsis Historia, and today we want to talk about the future of Shakespeare and the future of the Shakespeare authorship question. We're going to dive into maybe why hasn't Oxfordianism totally taken over? Why is it not accepted in the academies? Why is Baconianism not taken over? Why is it not accepted in the academies? What do we need to do to get it there? And what does this mean for Shakespeare at large? Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Apocalypsis Historia. We are back with another entry into our Shakespeare authorship series. This one coming at you today hopefully on the shorter side, or what we consider to be short around here, and probably a little more freestyle, a little more free-flowing as we sort of still gather the rest of our research for the next kind of big, long, epic episode, or per se, that we hope to get garner many comments and scathing remarks and rebuttals. So we'll see. But otherwise, I'm going to hand it off to Chance here. Stick around. I still have some books I'd like to always share at the end of each of these episodes, just to sort of see what's on everyone's mind, or see how we can always relate it back to this question as well. But without further ado, we'll introduce our head skeptic here, and here we go, Mr. Chance Colbert.
All right, welcome back, folks. We are here to talk about maybe what is the future of the Shakespeare authorship question. And this article, or this essay, I think sums it up better than anything I've seen. I came across this article recently, and I think that even though it's older, this is from 91 or something, I think that it's still incredibly relevant, and we have not gotten past this sort of hump.
And I think to follow that train of thought, I think it's really funny you just found this on the heels of the podcast that we just released, because I feel like very much of the things that we were sort of speculating on are almost sort of confirmed by some of this, right?
Right. And we'll get to specifically what he's talking about as we read through this. But this is by a guy named David Chandler. He's a Shakespeare skeptic. He's a scholar, as it says here. Obtained his PhD at Oxford, big shot. Specializes in romanticism, Keats, that kind of thing. Published many journals. Talks about Charles Lamb, and Charles Lamb's awesome. If you haven't read Charles Lamb, go read Charles Lamb. He's a guy from the same time as Keats and Wordsworth and Coleridge and that crowd, the Romantics. But he's not really a great poet. He's a great essayist. And he's absolutely obsessed with the Elizabethans, as are all those other poets that I've named. And that's why their poetry is so great. They really go back to the source and go back to the the fountain, and they really dig a lot of great material. And that's why Keats is a sonneteer. And so, what is David Chandler going to say here? Well, he's saying historicizing difference. Anti-Stratfordians, which we now say post-Stratfordians, but as me and Brady have sort of brought up in our group theory wins video, people aren't really at a post-Stratfordian stance. They're just at an anti-Stratfordian stance, or as we said, a trans-Stratfordian stance, because all you're doing is just replacing the Stratford man with who you think is a better iteration of the supposed Renaissance poet. And to be fair, Brady and I are partly trying to do that. We're not only trying to do that, but we are trying to maybe suggest with several of our videos that Philip Sidney is, if we're talking about just the best Renaissance poet, in English, that's Philip Sidney.
There is some properly unaccredited genius amidst this whole thing. Yeah,
that maybe a name does need to be thrown into the ring. That said, that to get truly post-Stratfordian, there needs to be things done yet. We have to actually dispel the Stratfordian myth fully, and you have to fully replace it with your own theory. We have some great hypotheses out there with De Vere or Bacon, or some lesser hypotheses like Marlowe or Neville, I think that there's some great hypotheses out there that are still yet not fully studied enough, like Mary Sidney. That said, like, these are just hypotheses. They're not full theories because they don't have a theoretical or critical stance on how to read literature, and how to specifically read Shakespeare, how to specifically read Elizabethan literature. Oxfordians, for all of their work, have not constructed a critical theoretical body of work that tells you how to read literature and why you should read it that way. Almost any like new idea that's going to come in to revolutionize Shakespeare needs to revolutionize literature at this point, because that's what Shakespeare does. And so if you're trying to come in here and fully explain that no, it's not the Stratford man, it's X, then X not only needs to be seen in that literature, it needs to be explained what the relationship is to all the other writers. It needs to be explained what influences it comes from, where it goes. And you need to be able to read that work with a certain critical viewpoint to try and pull out certain ideas, certain themes, have its own form of, hermetic analysis. Hermeneutic analysis. Okay, so let's see. What does David Chandler say? It says, Shakespeare's studies have expanded dramatically since the 18th century, always incorporating profound differences of opinion. This has never been more true, perhaps, than in the period since the 1960s, with the rise of several competing theories sponsoring a diverse series of approaches to Shakespeare's work. Such differences in scholarly and critical opinion can and should be healthy, promoting new insights and generating new questions. So all you guys out there that don't like dissent, just remember dissent's part of a healthy discourse. Like, in order for this thing to not get stale, people need to continually ask questions and dissent so that you can really be firm in why you think you're right. And if you're not firm in why you think you're right, maybe relook at it. So let me see. On the whole, this is the case. Experts nowadays with widely differing viewpoints meet frequently at conferences and books, journals to challenge each other's conclusions and to confirm the value of their larger common enterprise. But one group of Shakespeareans, the so-called anti-Stratfordians, have almost invariably been excluded from the discussion. And that's still largely the case. This is 30 plus years later, and that is still largely the case. It's maybe seen in a few academic circles. I know NYU ran a course for a little bit. It's at Bristol University, or I forget which university. There's one out of London that was running a master's course. Maybe they're still running a master's course in Shakespeare authorship doubts, as well as state-run propaganda. Shout out. And there's some university scholars like Strip Matter and others, Patrick Buckridge, that totally doubt Shakespeare and write about it, but largely it's still not taught, it's still not questioned in academic circles. So, they've not been ignored by other Shakespeareans. Samuel Schoenbaum remarks with a certain indignation that the anti-Stratfordian movement has been more abundantly chronicled than legitimate Shakespearean biography. So it's like, people that are amateur scholars have... pretty much any Shakespeare doubter you see is probably an amateur scholar. From now or back then. Stotzenberg, Greenwood, all amateur scholars. Yet, there's so many of them. It's almost like this question calls them into being scholars. But they have consistently met with incomprehension and contempt. Not surprisingly, and shout out to ThouTube, shout out to Jeff Mead, that you guys have totally, been this is incomprehensible, this is contemptible. So, it still happens now. Not surprisingly then, many anti-Stratfordian writers have responded by assuming an aggressively defensive anti-establishment posture. Totally true, right? Go watch any Oxfordian, go watch Bastian Conrad's Marlovian stuff. They're going to say these academics don't know anything what they're talking about. They're a bunch of wahoos that are either gatekeeping or stupid. And maybe there's some legitimacy to that claim. Shout out to Jonathan Bate and Alan Nelson, who are not my favorite scholars. Let's see. Difference is hardened into antagonism, yet the possibility of a dialogue is still sometimes mentioned. And yeah, we've had a few debates on the internet, but largely those have not continued to happen. It turned into both sides debated, and they retreated back to their sides, feeling more affirmed than ever in their views. No real discourse or dialectic was had. Oxfordians, with Waugh's v. Bate debate, Oxfordians felt like they concluded they won. They showed that the Stratfordians were, totally unprepared, and the Stratfordians walked away from that thinking that Jonathan Bate had totally settled the case, and the Oxfordians were wahoos. And I do lean towards Waugh in that debate. He totally clowns Jonathan Bate, who, as I said, I'm not one of my favorite scholars. That said, it was not fully answered or reconciled because they were arguing past each other a lot of the time. Let's see. The possibility seldom amounts to anything more than the assumption that the other side might be obliged to concede a few weaknesses in their argument, which has totally happened definitely on the Stratfordian side. There's been so much more.
Well, he must have ridden with this guy, or
Yes.
this guy must have tutored under him, or maybe he just borrowed some of that stuff. Yeah,
There's been
definitely having to give ground.
Yeah, it's no longer this super heralded boy genius Shakespeare anymore. It's he's now this working man that just really gets the times. Yet, even this usually points to the reiterated fantasy that the authorship question exists in a sort of ahistorical, untheoretical space. This article denies that space and tries to explain why dialogue has always failed in the past by examining the rise of anti-Stratfordianism, more specifically, Baconianism and Oxfordianism, not simply in terms of its difference from, but also in its relation to Orthodox Shakespeare studies. So let's unpack that real quick. It's always failed by examining the rise of anti-Stratfordianism in relation to and difference from Orthodox Shakespeare studies. Moreover, it tries to point to the sort of preconditions required if productive dialogue is to be finally joined now. It begins, however, by reviewing a recent discussion of the authorship question. Okay, let's go further. Okay, it says Oxfordians. Oh, sorry, I've scrolled too far. David Cathman's article, Why I'm Not an Oxfordian, which, check out that article, adopted the tone of condescending superiority, which anti-Stratfordians find infuriating. Yeah, just read our comment boards, where you have usually an Oxfordian, maybe Pat, maybe Vet Stadium, arguing with an Oxfordian, maybe Thou Too, maybe Jeff Mead, and there's this super anti-establishment tone. There's this frustration. It begins with a thumbnail biography of William Shakespeare, the Stratford man dramatist for the last 150 years or so, a steady stream of writers, many of them quite intelligent but generally without training in Elizabeth literary history, have argued William Shakespeare of Stratford did not write the plays and poems attributed to him. The views of the stream of writers has been ignored or contemptuously dismissed by the mainstream Shakespeare establishment. Cathman then explains some of the major reasons why the mainstream Shakespeare scholars do not take Oxfordians seriously. Taking as a case in Oxfordian methodology, Ogburn's Mysterious William Shakespeare. He first argues that the Stratfordian case is basically irrefutable, given that it rests on perfectly standard evidence of the type used by literary historians. And so this used by literary historians, Ogburn, I guess, isn't a literary historian, so he must be wrong. What Chandler, who wrote this article, is going to get at is that this whole idea of a literary historian is itself a myth, okay? Because that whole idea that people have been studying literary history in the academy for forever, that's not true. That doesn't happen until, honestly, starts happening in the late 1800s. And when that starts happening, it's not like the people that are hired to do it for the first time are absolutely perfect at what they do. And so it really takes until the 1920s for modern Western academia in the English humanities literature studies to fully codify as a worthwhile subject in the university. A lot of people looked down on the idea of studying literature. They didn't see the point of it or understand it. And especially English literature, yeah, sure, go read the classics. But why are we reading, English literature in a university? Like maybe a course or two. It doesn't need its whole department. But by the 1920s, it had, and, that was with the rise of literature and, British and American, publishing circles. And with that, though, once it's codified in the 1920s, by then, those people have to totally justify, absolutely 100% justify, vindicate their department, their subject. And so anything that calls into doubt what they are trying to establish firmly as a necessary thing in the university, anything that undercuts that needs to go away and disappear immediately. And so the idea that that person that's supposed to be the greatest at the thing that you're teaching may not even be the guy that you say that he is, that cannot be an acceptable thing. And so it has to be just completely vanquished from the academic circles, as the academic circles are themselves codifying. So this whole idea that, Kathman says that it's not the type of evidence that perfectly standard, literary historians would use.
Appeal to authority fallacy.
Yeah,
right?
there is no perfectly standard literary historian, and call out what is wrong if it's wrong, but don't appeal to authority, as Brady said. And so that's what the Stratfordians do in large cases. They just dismiss it outright because it's not from orthodox circles. And that's totally true. It's totally a problem, and it needs to stop. But why have the Oxfordians failed? It's not just like the Stratfordians are being poo-poo bummy heads and we're all being perfect, and just if they would just quit being poo-poo heads, Edward de Vere would be Shakespeare. I know a lot of you Oxfordians out there think that. But have you ever asked yourself, why that is the case? Why can you not get your theory out there? Is it just because these gatekeepers are gatekeeping? There are people in academic circles that you can change their mind. There's ways that you can show that they're wrong. You have to use their tactics, though. And so, what's the problem with Oxfordians?
Yeah, where's that inflection point between, where's the ignition,
At some point, plenty of other departments and subjects are having massive revolutionary overturn in what they believe. Even archaeology, who has been the most stubborn of all subjects in, the last 100 years about changing their mind, even they're changing. A lot of the, early paleological studies on humans is overturning stuff. A lot of specifically dating when the populating of Americas happens. For the longest time, it was Clovis first, 15,000 years ago. That's the oldest it gets. Maybe 20,000 with some early stragglers. But that's all being completely overhauled in real time right now. Go look at freaking Göbekli Tepe, overhauling our entire idea of the Neolithic, revolution. So
the mammoth discoveries in California.
Yeah,
that was so crazy. That's 130,000 years.
Mastodon caves. Yeah. But that said, it's not happening in English literature, and so why not? It's because the evidence hasn't been so conclusive that it can be denied.
Compelling, but...
It's compelling. It's suggestive. It's thought-provoking. It clearly shows that we don't have the full answer, but you have not presented enough of a hypothesis to turn it into a theory. So let's see why. Well, Oxfordians make the error of reading the plays along autobiographical lines. Further, they, Ogburn at least, employ an enormous double standard, admitting evidence for their case that is weak or weaker than Stratfordian evidence they seek to discredit. There are a number of theoretical issues raised here, needless to say, but Kathman descends to particulars. The bulk of his article takes issue with the Ogburn on specific points. On the whole, Kathman clearly considers suspect evaluation evidence to be the main problem. He concludes with some unearned sentiment about both parties loving Shakespeare. None of this amounts to an explanation of why Kathman's non-Oxfordian, at least not in the way a non-Christian may explain his or her absence of belief by reference to inconsistencies in the gospel. Okay, so there's some problems with it, but that doesn't really say what your exact stance on the problems are. That doesn't say what you think about what works about it. You're not fully answering the question. But let's continue further. So that's what David Kathman says is the problem with Oxfordians. That's not what Chandler says. And let me see. I'm going to skip further so we can get to... and this is where he... sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. This is where Chandler starts going into the history that I sort of summarized for you already. And as he's doing it, he's going to super unpack what's not only happening in the academic circles, but he's also going to unpack what's happening in the Shakespeare doubter circles. And he's saying, look, Baconianism not only rises out of the 1800s, but it specifically rises out of the anti-establishment circles. It rises out of people that are retired thinkers, smart people that want to go into their nooks and studies by the fireside and go try and decode Bacon on their own. And because of this, you never get a cohesive circle. You do get a lot of people agreeing with each other and saying things, but you don't get like these fellowships coming about. And yeah, you get Potts does the Bacon Society, and yes, that starts to pop up. But by and large, it's a bunch of disparate people, not just from America, but England, Germany, that are just trying to come up with their own Baconian theories. And their theories are not only like coming from non-establishment places, but their theories are like non-establishment type theories. They're making cryptographic readings. They're doing all sorts of gematria.
And never academic friendly sort of.
Yeah, it's not
There's not quite enough narrative. Even if a lot of that stuff's true, which is sort of where you and I would even kind of agree with, is there's not enough of a narrative for them to sort of like what's the reasoning or what are they getting at.
I'm glad you brought that up because Chandler's going to get to that whole idea of a narrative or a framework to put facts into. And so necessarily the Baconian movement, and we're still there, guys. Like, as much as Baconians are still out there and gaining ground, it's still not a cohesive theory, and it's a bunch of people in their houses turning the pages and trying to decode Bacon on their own and putting their internet theories up. And it's never going to get past that, and we're just going to have generation after generation of these Baconians decoding stuff in their living rooms. And we're still going to have Stratford taught in the university. So what is this doing for us? And so ultimately, and I'll get back to what the real flaw with Oxfordians is. I know I cut that off, but I'm going to come back to that. But ultimately, what Chandler is getting at with this is that when you see on our comment board or another comment board where you have Stratfordians and Oxfordians arguing past each other, what's happening is they're both dropping facts on each other. These facts seemingly are true in both sides. So one person says their facts that thinks the other person's facts are refuted. One person says their facts and thinks that the other person's facts are refuted. But the problem is that it's not an argument of facts. What we have here is something larger than that. We have an argument of framework. And if you don't have a framework or context for those facts are going to be meaningless. And so Oxfordians are giving facts that are totally useful in an Oxfordian framework to a bunch of Stratfordians who those facts are useless to Stratfordians. They don't have a framework for it. Those facts mean nothing to them. And vice versa. And that's going to continue to happen if we don't understand each person's framework. And if we, as Shakespeare doubters, are not coming up with a framework for our hypotheses, they're never going to get to theories. And so Oxfordians have not constructed a framework. They keep going in and say, veer, it's got the word ever, it means veer. 17, it means to veer. It means to veer. What is the framework here? Why is he writing these things? Why are they being published when they're published? Why are they being played when they're played? What is the difference in the time between? What is the relationship to other names that seemingly are pen names, like Thomas Dekker or Thomas Nash? Richard Barnfield. What is the relationship there? What is the relationship of Oxford to the Rosicrucian movement? What is the relationship of Oxford to Bacon? What is
the Essex movement?
Yeah.
It's just so many other things because I feel like, there is so much to account for.
There's no framework for
and
any
like you
of
said
that.
earlier, Cecil is censoring Oxford, but Oxford is also censoring Oxford. But okay, so They were both doing it themselves. Like, what's the get up here?
Yeah, if any of you guys out there, especially you Oxfordians, have seen the movie Anonymous, or listened to a lot of Oxfordian speakers, specifically Stephanie Hughes or even Alexander Waugh, they will tell you that De Vere wanted to very nobly keep his name out of it. It wasn't about De Vere, it was about the art itself. So De Vere used his pen name Shakespeare. But then those same exact people tell you that the reason that we don't know De Vere is De Vere is because the Cecils kept it secret. But wait a second, didn't De Vere want it secret? Okay, so then the Cecils are working with De Vere. But no, those same exact people, as the movie Anonymous will show, those Oxfordians believe that the Cecils hated De Vere and vice versa. But at the end of the day, like, that doesn't make any sense. If Cecil hates De Vere, then he's doing exactly what De Vere wanted, because you said De Vere wanted to keep his name secret. So what is it? Which is it? I don't understand. And by the way, that movie is absolute trash. I'm a fan of the Oxfordian theory, but that movie is just one of the worst renditions of, like, muddling down things, watering down things, mixing up dates, just completely ahistorical. They're like Jurassic Park's more historically accurate. Like, that said, Rhys Ifans is awesome. Everybody else is crap. That's enough for my review of Anonymous. That said,
no, come back for that episode. Yeah. No, honest, he's kidding, but yeah.
We do not get a framework. Like, even the movie Anonymous doesn't give us a framework. It just kind of shows De Vere in 1593 thinking that theater could rule the world, and then I guess De Vere writes everything, and then he dies, and then Ben Jonson gets his plays when the Globes burn down, and then publishes them 19 years later randomly. Not sure why, but the movie doesn't explain that. But that's the point. The movie didn't have a framework from Oxfordian theory to put that into perspective. Why are the sonnets being published in 1609? Why are the plays being published in 1623? Why all the weird crypticism with all the grave plate stuff, all the dedication? What's all happening here? You need a framework for it before you can be conclusive. And, it's not only Oxfordians that are guilty of this. It's just they're the number one spot, so they're the first to be called out. But this is true of Baconians. This is true of Marlovians. Brady and I don't have a full framework. We're trying to build one, but I think what Brady and I have at least understood is that if you go on a solo theory alone, good luck. Good luck trying to build a framework for this. It's not going to make sense. You're not going to be able to explain why there's a pen name. On surface level, maybe. Oh, Marlowe was going to be killed for treason, so he had to escape and change his name. But if he escaped to Italy, why the heck did he have to change it to an English name? And why use all these English names? And none of it makes any sense. Oxfordians, he did this nobly so that it wasn't about him or about the art. Okay, fine, I'll buy that, but don't give me the Cecil line. At some point, Cecil's the guy that raised this guy. At some point, Cecil is a big reason why Oxford has all the knowledge that he does. I don't have the quote on me, but there's a quote about Cecil's house, that it was the salon of learning of Renaissance England. Okay? And it's not just Oxford that's coming up in this house. Bacon has a lot of connection to the Cecil house. Sidney has a lot of connection to the Cecil house. Rosley's raised in the Cecil house. Manners partly raised in the Cecil house. John Florio's supposed to be a tutor or a servant in the Cecil house.
Neville there at all?
I'm sure Neville is, because he's Bacon's nephew. The Cecil house is the connection with all these people. Cecil is the Secretary of State. He's the guy that wields the power to do or not do these things. Same with Francis Walsingham, for that matter. He is the Queen's spy master. He's essentially the head of the CIA, FBI, National Intelligence. I hear people try and pitch Marlowe. Marlowe used Walsingham's connections to get his death faked. Maybe that's possibly true, but you have to start working out why Walsingham, who is supposed to be the same guy that wants him killed, is the guy that's also trying to help him fake his death. Like, what's happening there? I don't understand that. Like, isn't Marlowe running away from Walsingham? Maybe not. Maybe you Marlovians know more than I do on that. But Bacon, like, why the pen name? Why not just put Francis Bacon? He was accredited as this heralded genius. Why the pen name? It's part of this Rosicrucian Masonic movement, maybe? But if so, that definitely begs that it's more than one person. And I think even at this point, Baconians, for the most part, have acknowledged Henry Neville's presence in the folio, if not other biographical details that match up with the plays and poetry. So I think even at this point, Baconians aren't 100% solo theorists. But I still see Oxfordians cling to that. And at this point, like, you have to give a framework for why and how all these things are happening, and you're not going to be able to do it on Oxford alone. Good luck. So let's see. Stratfordians have often smiled patronizingly at the naivete of Looney's methods, but have generally failed to acknowledge that the early 20th century produced a lot of perfectly orthodox Shakespearean criticism, colored by Dowden, which they would find equally naive. So, yeah, all these Stratfordians that are from the year 2023 or 1990 or 2005 or something, they'll go back and, oh, you Oxfordians are ridiculous. You build your theories off of a guy from 1920 something. So do you. What are you talking about? So do you Stratfordians. Like, and way older than 1920, and a lot of it's sketchy scholarship. That's the truth. Looney is quite understandable. He took the case against the Stratford man put forward by Baconians and widely accepted, and combined its conclusions with the post-Dowden desire to read the plays as representing an intimate, credible psychodrama. Now, whether or not you can do that with every single part of every single play and every single poem, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that. You can't do that with any art. You can't do that with any literature. But you should be able to do it as a collective aggregate whole for each play or each poem or each collection of play or poem. And at some point, you should be able to place the author in the writing. We're not yet to new criticism. Shakespeare didn't know about new criticism. How in the world could he divorce himself so much from what is in there? And then Stratfordians go, oh, no, he totally puts himself in there. If you go read Merry Wives of Windsor, it's got some Stratford characters. Like, don't talk to me about Merry Wives of frickin' Windsor, okay? That stuff's got bacon all over it. And then, to boot, there's a million other plays that are way more notable and famous and probably better. So, like, at some point, what is the psychology that is getting placed into these plays and poetry? And that is where Brady and I are really trying to build a framework. Because Oxfordians started to do that. Oh, look, Hamlet's got some biography. Lear's got some biography. Timon of Athens got some biography. Sure, it's all got biography. But, like, why these exact lines? Why these exact sentiments? When I'm going to write an essay about it from an Oxfordian standpoint, what sort of things do I need to start looking for and emphasize? What themes am I most interested in? Almost none of that's been explicated or gotten consensus. There's a lot of Oxfordians that want to do a bunch of Tudor Prince stuff. A lot of Baconians want to do a bunch of Tudor Prince stuff, which, you know, that's what got Freud into the Oxfordian thing in the first place. The greatest Oxfordian scholar there was, I forget his name, but he was totally a wackadoo Tudor Prince guy. And, you know, no offense if you're a Tudor Prince person, I don't mean you're a wackadoo, but generally speaking, it is sort of fringe. And, you know, I've seen some things in Shakespeare myself that make me want to make Tudor Prince readings. Like, go read Coriolanus and, like, tell me there's not some weird Oedipal stuff happening in that play. Obviously Hamlet, right? Okay, so let me see. The popularity of the Oxfordian thesis is a piece with the continuing popularity of Dowden's Shakespeare, perhaps the most successful study of the dramatist ever published. Either both are discredited by being popular, or neither is. In fact, as any teacher of English lit knows, the most profound influence the Academy ever exerted over general reading habits was the diffusion of the idea that a writer can be recognized in his work. That's what people love. That's why you have about the author on the back. So don't tell us that you're not supposed to look for, you know, psychology or biography. You're not supposed to go look for the author. That would be
guys, just forget about Dostoevsky when you're reading Crime and Punishment. Not relevant. Russia and Dostoevsky connection, like, maybe you'll find some stuff. Like, come on.
Yeah. Toni Morrison, her upbringing had nothing to do with her literature.
You can't find her anywhere. Yeah.
Okay. And, like, you know, and these Toni Morrison's totally post-New Criticism, and she herself is very abstract, highfalutin, but you can totally place Toni within our literature, right? Why would we not be able to do that with the writer or writers of Shakespeare? So, let's see. Surveying both Baconianism and Oxfordianism in the original context, it is clear both have been a belated aspect. And so, like, if these had just come around a little earlier, they may have way more ground because they would have gotten around before the Academy codified. And the Academy could have codified with these ideas already in place. And these ideas would have been incepted into the Academy or already initiated into the Academy, but they didn't get to. But as Chandler points out here, is that, like, at some point, like, that was inevitable. Like, the rise of this had to happen at the same time as the rise of academia. I want to give a line here. Speculation regarding the author's mind personality was laid aside in favor of technical analysis of the words on the page. In the 1930s and 1940s, this tendency strengthened. T.S. Eliot, in support of his anti-biographical case, draws on this critical revolution, of course. And as I've mentioned in other videos, T.S. Eliot's a great poet, but he's a dunce when it comes to writing about Elizabethan literature. He writes a lot of essays about Elizabethan literature, and there are good points in it, and there are some famous terms that come from it. But his handle on Elizabethan literature is not great, and two, like, he says a lot of wacky things. Like, he heralds Middleton over the rest of the non-Shakespeare crowd, and then he totally pedestalizes Shakespeare and just says, look, these other guys aren't even worthy of Shakespeare. And T.S. Eliot also said, don't try and read into Shakespeare. It's too good to try and read biography, which, you know, I know T.S. Eliot's sort of like the modernist, and he wants to be as dehumanizing as possible, but I won't accept his thesis. It's ridiculous, and he needs to stick to poetry. Shots fired. All right. As regards Shakespeare's biography, it was in the early 1930s, according to Schoenbaum, that a critical turning point was reached. The heyday of subjectivism was over. Looney was convinced that biographical criticism, as he practiced it, was here to stay, and moreover that his own work would do much more to promote it. And, you know, Looney, in fact, seems to have been much more aware than many subsequent Oxfordians that his factual case was very much tied up with a theory about how to read literature. And so, like, Looney is still ahead of the curve for most Oxfordians for how to build a framework for tying all of these facts together and projecting it into a critical theory. Since the 1920s, Oxfordianism has established itself as the standard form of anti-Stratfordianism, but it has not had any impact on the academic establishment. You know, no direct impact. It's not being taught in the schools. And so he says this has something to do with the factual problems, but it's not the crux of the matter. Because it's not, like I said, about the facts. It's about the framework. So, considered in abstract terms, there is no reason why Oxfordians and champions of the orthodox Shakespeare should not be able to engage in productive dialogue. After all, scholars of Homer have often divided on questions respecting the genesis and authorship of Homeric poems, and most criticism of Shakespeare is a value quite independent of the question who authored the plays. So, yeah, if people are able to talk about Shakespeare productively, and if people are able to talk about other authorship questions productively, why are we not able to talk about a Shakespeare authorship question productively?
Why only in the Apocalypsis Historia Commons can we have a healthy debate?
So, in practical terms, however, the problem is that Oxfordian work has not been recognized, so the mainstream academics have not recognized Oxfordians as having interpretive value independent of its claim of the authorship question. So this is what I'm getting at. This is the lack of framework. Oxfordians have all sorts of criticism and insight onto how to spot the authorship and to how to spot De Vere, but can they tell you anything else about the plays? Why are these plays important? What was De Vere's purpose? What is the insight behind that? Is there anything else other than De Vere wrote these plays? So far, not really. And so, yeah, I mean, like, it's ironic because, like, it's coming from not just the Oxfordian circles that are lacking sort of interpretive value. Like, that happens within these Stratfordian circles, right? Like, Harold Bloom, right?
Yeah, so this is from Harold Bloom's Shakespeare, The Invention of a Human, and he's got his name just as big as Shakespeare's name, as we like to kind of jest about. But yeah, it's this sort of a resistance to, it's the Stratfordian problem, like he just said here. But here's it in some other words in which the intro of this book, Bloom is talking about what he calls French Shakespeare. Is the procedure is to begin with a political stance all your own, far out and away from Shakespeare's plays, and then to locate some marginal bit of English Renaissance social history that seems to sustain your stance. Social fragment in hand, you move in from outside upon the poor play and find some connection, however established, between your supposed social fact and Shakespeare's works. And so yeah, he's literally saying like people are in modern times are sort of back attributing or sort of trying to look with modern lens upon the landscape of back in olden times. But even though he admits like even if it's a pretty good connection, like how dare you or whatever, and to continue on some of maybe Bloom's more ironic statements, maybe also for our audience as well. And to finish this last sentence from or one of these last sentences from the intro. He, as in Shakespeare, has become the first universal author, replacing the Bible in the secularized consciousness. Attempts to historicize his ascendancy continue to founder upon the uniqueness of his eminence, for the cultural factors critics find relevant to Shakespeare are precisely as relevant to Thomas Dekker and to George Chapman. Newfangled expositions of Shakespeare do not persuade us, because their implicit program involves diminishing the difference between Shakespeare and the likes of Chapman. So Bloom is definitely way less, properly academic about the whole thing.
Yeah.
But the emotional resonance of the argument is still there. It's like it's not convincing. Like we can't latch on. There's not enough whole cloth for us to sort of agree upon.
Right, and also just showing the ridiculous bias that's happening within the Stratfordian establishment. That even though Bloom's not a super literary professor scholar, he is totally super published Shakespearean, and
he's going to want to be on Charlie Rose. Getting to talk about why Shakespeare is. Just read it. Don't even try to look for the biography. Just read it for its implicit sort of eminence, right? As he literally says.
Sitting there saying that there's no reason to compare Dekker and Chapman with Shakespeare, and the
ironies hurt if you watch our Nash Dekker video.
Guys, that's a bit. I mean, Harold Bloom. If I could pull up my Richard III Yale copy, he has an essay in that where he goes on and on about how Shakespeare's the only guy that could have written Richard III, and except Marlowe could have probably written Richard III. He says. And then at the end of the essay, he says, during the essay, he says, look, Shakespeare totally gets his idea for Richard III from Marlowe. And, Marlowe, other than Jew of Malta, never wrote anything as good as Richard III. But Marlowe could have totally maybe written Richard III. Not that he did, but he had the capability of it. But then at the end of the essay, Harold Bloom concludes that anybody else other than Shakespeare, Richard III would be an absolute triumph, but for Shakespeare, it's one of his lesser stuff, which I disagree with in many, many, many ways. Richard III is freaking fantastic, and if you're not reading Richard III, you're not a real Shakespearean, honest to God. And furthermore, the idea that Marlowe, it would be a triumph for Marlowe, he said earlier in the thing that Marlowe could have totally written Richard III, and it's still not as good as Jew of Malta. So why is he saying that, for Shakespeare it's lesser stuff, but for Marlowe it's a triumph? He completely contradicts himself all the time, and he's a ridiculous windbag, and thank goodness he's gone. That's my stance on Harold Bloom, ladies and gentlemen. But go read your Bloom. It's fun. All right, let's see. In other words, Oxfordian criticism is commonly believed, and not entirely unfairly, to be concerned merely with tying the life of De Vere more firmly to his supposed works. Tell me that's not true. Like, go to Waugh, go to Ron Rothfull, go to Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship, or Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, go to Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, all of them. They just continually just keep trying to tie the life of De Vere with the works of Shakespeare. But what is the ultimate goal behind that other than just trying to prove that your guy is Shakespeare? Like, what kind of critical stance can I take from that? What kind of larger framework do I have to read literature, and especially Elizabethan literature? Like, I don't really have anything other than maybe they're using a bunch of encoded stuff, but that's not even a specifically Oxfordian claim. That's more appropriately a Baconian claim.
Right, we're all playing Where's Waldo, but we're sort of asking what's Waldo doing.
Yeah, why is Waldo even there? Like, why is Waldo in this exact picture in that exact spot that he's in? Like, you got to answer that. It's not happening. Nevertheless, professional Shakespeareans naturally shy away from public discussion of the authorship question because they don't want to stake their reputations on something which may be very tangential to their concerns, in which their anti-Stratfordians opponents have clearly spent much more time preparing for. So at some point, like, there's a reason, Jonathan Bate doesn't want to debate Waugh. Waugh every day spends time trying to figure out how Jonathan Bate's wrong. Jonathan Bate does not spend all his time trying to figure out how Waugh is wrong. So Waugh probably should have beat the snot out of Bate in that debate, and he did. After all, would Oxfordians be prepared to debate the theoretical implications of new historicism on television? Like, would you want to go, if you know all about how Oxford Shakespeare, would you want to go toe-to-toe on television explaining the hermeneutic theory of Shakespeare sonnets? Like, no, you're not going to win that against Waugh, because Waugh spent a bunch of time doing, or sorry, not Waugh. You're not going to win that against Bate. Bate spent all his, free time figuring that out. You've been figuring out who De Vere is. So, like, at some point, you're going to be able to beat them on those facts, but that's not part of their framework. Those aren't the facts that they're interested in.
Everyone's, like, beating each other at their own game.
Yeah. So Oxfordians should accept this and either understand their work is quite separate from the end of the academy, or look for ways in which to construct productive dialogue on interpretive issues. So I think more the first is happening. I think Oxfordians have kind of given up on trying to get into the academy, and they're just trying to build their body of work outside the academy. And it's slowly growing, but it's not like it's all over the media. It's not like a bunch of young people are looking at it. Brady and I consider ourselves younger for, relative to the crowd that is doing this, but even we're old hats compared to the kids coming up in high school, and those kids couldn't care less about Shakespeare, much less a Shakespeare authorship question. They definitely don't want to hear that some rich earl is the guy behind it. They don't want to hear it. So even if you are right, you're not going to convince them by just doing all these kinds of decoder ring tricks. You're going to have to incept the mind of the common man through media, or you're going to have to work your way into the academies. Good luck on the first one. It's not going to happen. You can't outdo Disney. So maybe start looking how to do the second one. So what do? We got to get some dialogue on interpretive issues. So a conference on Shakespeare and the feudal order, for example, featuring both Oxfordian and Orthodox scholars, could, at least one imagines, yield interesting results. So there, David Chandler gave you a freaking freebie there. Says, look, there are ways to go about having these critical, theoretical, interpretive discussions and still tie in your authorship theories. Still tie in your beliefs of Shakespeare into how you read Shakespeare. At some point, like, all you Oxfordians out there, you have such belief about who Shakespeare is, but what does that mean to you about the plays? Is it anything more than worship of Edward de Vere? Let me know in the comments. Sound it out. But not irrelevant to the authorship question. In such context, Mutual respect could be established without the insidious pressure of one side being supposedly right and the other wrong. The Oxfordian movement could undoubtedly increase its intellectual status if it shows itself capable of impacting positively on such contemporary interpretive concerns. And, this is 30 years old, but still the same thing applies. Like, that doesn't not apply now. Like, as we said, the English university studies haven't changed all that much other than the rise of post-colonialism. Other than that, new criticism still reigns. People are still doing the different historical genre studies as they do, and otherwise things are still ticking. Yeah, a lot more post-colonial type interpretations, which clearly Brady and I are influenced by, right? We definitely have an anti-imperialist sort of sensibility with our readings, our critiques, and our framework that we're trying to establish. What do Oxfordians have to say about any of that? And to be fair, Stratfordians don't have much to say either. But these sorts of things need to be established so that you can come into the university, you can come to the academies, say, look, this is what I use when I read Shakespeare, and this is how I know more about Shakespeare, and Shakespeare means more to me and can do so much more because of these readings. Until you do that, look, we're going to be arguing until the cows come home. So you've got to start constructing that. And so the alternative is to make Oxfordianism into a cult and to preserve it for better or worse as part of Bartha's ordinary culture. So 30 years on, this is kind of looking like what's happening. So look, you can, like you said, you can try and enter the conversation into the academies, or the alternative is you're going to just end up building up a cult, which, it's going to be part of the everyday ordinary culture. It's part of the world. It's something that is out there in the media, and if you can get it big enough, maybe you will end up influencing enough people so that there are people in the academies and establishment to do it. But that's a super long con, and just heads up, Oxfordians, you're not winning that battle. Baconians are. Baconians are totally winning that battle. 50 years from now, when a lot of silent era, boomer era, Gen Xers, maybe even millennials, not around anymore, and it's, Zoomers are the oldest ones around, Oxford's going to be gone because you didn't latch on to any Zoomers. Baconians aren't doing the greatest job, but theirs are much more prone to relate to, Zoomers who understand internet theory, understand secrecy. Yeah. Baconians at least get much closer ties to secret societies, and these Zoomers are totally indoctrinated to believe that if there's stuff happening in the background, it's by secret societies, the Illuminati. Go on to TikTok, you'll see any of those videos. Like, Baconians are going to have that, and if Oxfordians don't find some other way to either get into the academy or step the Baconians and the mass media movement, you feel like you're in first place now, but hold your breath. And it's not like the Baconians are going to override the establishment. As we said earlier, it's just going to keep being, a small percentage of people think that Bacon is Shakespeare because they've done all the legwork to find that out. And then everybody else is just going to keep thinking Stratford Man. So we're not going to get anywhere with the future of the Shakespeare authorship question if changes don't start happening. Brady and I are trying to do our end of the bargain. We're trying to look further into this to build a framework because we wanted to do that with Oxford. We desperately wanted to. We are Oxfordians in our evolution. That's what got us out of the Stratford into the whole conversation. That there was a guy to latch on to. But even in that, I have not been able to build a possible psychology to think through. There's not a framework for how to answer other questions. And because of that, there's gaps in our understanding. There's gaps in our hypothesis. And it needs to be filled in with maybe other people. And lo and behold, maybe Francis Bacon answers some of that. And as Brady and I dive into this, we're finding that there may be people that can actually give a psychological framework, that can maybe better answer some of these questions. They can give a framework for historical influence and how it fits into a timeline and what it means at large for how to read literature. And so Brady and I are totally pitching that this whole Shakespeare project is as Walt Whitman and Deli Bacon sort of say it, it's sort of this imperialist or proto-imperialist elite esoteric movement that is trying to influence the governancing bodies and the populace at large for how to think, act, and do. And that totally happens, by the way. And so when we go to read Shakespeare and we go to talk about it, we can pinpoint Sidney or De Vere or Bacon and say why they're writing what they're writing based on their own personal psychology, but also how it is, totally colored by or painted by this state-run imperialist esoteric propaganda. And it's going to be some admixture of those things that influences what is in the plays, but also you can do that with any piece of literature, guys. You don't have to do that only with Shakespeare. You can do that with anything. And so, yeah, Brady and I got a lot of legwork to do from here on out to fully codify and formalize that. But, something like that needs to happen on other people's end if they want to promote a hypothesis that turns into a theory. And as I said, it's not just about the Shakespeare authorship question. I teach English literature to high schoolers, and honestly, the only way I can get them interested in Shakespeare at all is to talk about the Shakespeare authorship question. I don't ever tell them that I latch onto a candidate. I pitch several candidates. I rarely ever even pitch Philip Sidney. I pitch the mainstream, the mainstream fringe, there's an oxymoron for you, authorship candidates. So De Vere, Bacon, Marlowe, Mary Sidney, Neville, Thomas North.
John Dee, shout out, probably somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Not as the main writer, but
John Florio, the influence of Dee and the esoteric stuff. That totally gets kids way, way more interested into reading Shakespeare, because I think even just a little tiny part of them thinks, maybe I can find out who it is. And, even if we do figure out who the Shakespeare is, and we conclusively prove to the academies and to the populace and to ourselves who Shakespeare is, I think even when that happens, that mystery of reading into it won't stop, because
it shouldn't it should demystify, but it should not devalue it, right? Yeah, there should be a sort of unveiling of what's a lot of this, like you're sort of talking about psychology and context, but I think we already admit that it's powerful stuff. There's a reason why it is to where it is at this certain point, and why people so obviously draw their battle lines, because there is a lot at stake in determining ultimately what it is. But I think why each side finds each other one not convincing enough is because it doesn't kind of fully kind of bring that all-encompassing view of it together, which is why I think group theory ultimately will be, even if there's a main hand maybe, but yeah, group theory it does accommodate for so many different things, it's it makes sense why Bacon's in there. It makes, we can make the De Vere readings, we can sort of I hate to say it, but we are able to sort of have our cake and eat it too sometimes, right? But it's maybe that's what we should be going for, is figuring out how to get those where it's so resounding and so undeniable maybe, or whatnot. Right. We always use the word parsimonious theory in psychology or whatnot. That's sort of our main sifting tool for getting down to the real truth.
Thomas Jefferson would say self-evident.
There you go.
Okay. It was Romanticism which changed the poem from being scandalously personal to a literary classic. The entire cultural field reorganized itself around a new assumption that the artistic mind was not just the vehicle for art, but was itself the art's proper subject. There is thus no value in Oxfordians, or Dowden and his followers, citing post-romantic writers on the subject of authorship as though the remarks had a timeless validity. And so that's a super deep point that, all of us that are so readily able to want to sift out biography, we haven't readily proven that that's a pre-romantic idea. And so I think if you want to fully explicate that, you have to show that the Romantics are taking that from the Elizabethans, which, fun fact, I think they totally are. But we need to talk about that in our critical interpretations, in our studies, in our theories. And so if you're pitching De Vere as Shakespeare, you need to sort of acknowledge the fact that, look, De Vere is the one influencing these romantics that come up with this whole idea of what the author is in the first place, that's making us want to find these authors in the second place. That needs to be done. Let's see. And so, but if this isn't possible, and it has to be assumed that, so if this was an idea that was current in the time, like, let's go find evidence for it. But if it's not possible, and it has to be assumed that such ideas were simply out there in the zeitgeist, in the air, like, and we just can't really prove it, but surely it was happening, then at least a much broader case needs to be constructed for the autobiographical nature of dramatic writing at that time. And that's also something Brady and I are trying to do, that, like, guys, this isn't just about Shakespeare. You need to go look at all the other plays and playwrights and see if you can find biography in those, for those writers, and see if that holds up to any scrutiny. As far as I'm aware, the most comprehensive attempt to do this has been William Honey's, but he was making a case for Marlowe's authorship of the Shakespeare plays, a premise which Oxfordians will reject immediately. Which, at some point, I also am very curious, if you're an Oxfordian out there, what is the relationship of Marlowe's plays to Shakespeare's plays? Like, at least Marlovians have a stance on that, and for the most part, Baconians do. I've never really heard a consensus viewpoint on what De Vere's relationship is to the Marlowe plays. Maybe a small fraction have suggested he wrote them, but for the most part, it seems to me that people suggest that Marlowe did actually write those, and people like Waugh have maybe intimated that there are good lines in Marlowe, or there's good stuff in Marlowe, because Marlowe worked with De Vere, and maybe De Vere penned a few lines or told Marlowe what to do, or just maybe De Vere's literary influence is so great on Marlowe that it's going to turn out better because De Vere's around.
Heck, even one time, I said that Marlowe was with Sidney one time, right? I think someone who tried to say that. He was traveling around with Sidney. It's no proof of that.
Yeah, that was Bastion, by the way. Not a real thing. So, like, at some point, where are these Marlowe plays coming from? Because as we have shown, and if you go read Donna Murphy, it's pretty conclusive. Whoever is writing Marlowe definitely has a hand in writing a lot of Shakespeare. Or whichever hands are writing Marlowe have a lot of hands in writing different sort of Shakespeare. And, stylometric evidence has shown this. Enough Marlovian studies have shown that there's way too much connection. But Oxfordians have mum to say about that. So, or maybe you do. Please, let me know in the comments. What is the relationship of Jew of Malta to De Vere? What is the relationship of Tamburlaine Part 1 and Part 2 to De Vere? I see Oxfordians claim Nash, claim Green. Maybe even some have claimed Peel, some have claimed Lilly. Do y'all claim Marlowe? Do y'all claim Thomas Kidd? How does that play into it? Let me know in the comments, please. Oxfordians, start pouring in. Or maybe we're all out here saying that Oxfordians are the favorites, and maybe there's not that many of you out there. I don't know. Honey's work ought, in fact, to convince Oxfordians that some more developed theoretical model of how individual experience shaped literary works in the late 16th century is needed before the specific case which they wish to present can be adjudicated. So, you need to understand how individual experience shapes literary works for the late 16th century. If you want to answer Shakespeare's authorship question, that is what you have to do. Whether you're Alexander Waugh, one of our commenters, whether me or Brady, whether Jonathan Badover at Oxford University, if you want to conclude who is Shakespeare, then you have to be able to first explain how individual experience shapes literary works in the 16th century. I'm really harping on that because the only way you're going to be able to do that is to start with Philip Sidney. Whether you think he's Shakespeare or not, you're going to have to do that with Philip Sidney. He's the first to do it. He's the first romantic. And I think once you start to do that, sorry, my dogs get all fired up when I start talking about Philip Sidney, but if you start to do that, you are going to be able to start to understand how all these poems, maybe not every single one, but many of these poems, but whether by Barnfield or Barnes or by Fletcher or by Constable or by Campion or by Daniel or by Drayton or by Marlowe or Chapman or Johnson, any of them you're going to be able to start to understand how to read their poetry if you look closely into Philip Sidney. He is the first to start putting his self-experience, for no other reason than to do it, into his poetry, much more so than, don't come at me talking about Henry Howard or Thomas Wyatt, much more so than they ever did. And he actually, Philip Sidney actually has essays about it. He has stories about it. He has letters about it. So in order to start grasping Shakespeare, you got to start studying a bunch of Philip Sidney. And maybe that'll start leading you down the road we're on. Tie this all off. So constructing one is an absolute monumental task, no doubt, but it is probably the only way now to reintegrate the Stratfordian and anti-Stratfordian traditions of scholarship. If we want to marry the two back together, if we want to finish this War of the Roses and get the white and red rose back together, this is what we have to do. So, Looney was, of his time, just perhaps his followers should not be so far behind theirs if they genuinely want to influence the future of Shakespeare studies. You need to definitely start bringing ideas that are in current literary topics, current critical ideas. You need to bring those into your authorship hypotheses and questions and discussion to start bringing it into the academic forefront. If you genuinely actually want to influence Shakespeare studies. And if you do that, people won't ignore it. If you can actually do that, people will not ignore it. And that's Brady and I's hope. We're not going to maybe be able to change everybody's viewpoints out there. We're going to hope to get some cool YouTube videos with the techno music and the slow motion and the graphics, as we get better at this. But even then, there's so much out there to compete with. The best way is going to be to convince those in the university. Because if you can start getting them to be convinced of it, high school curriculums will change. And the way kids are taught it will change. And then all of a sudden, you will be able to post those YouTube videos with the cool techno and get the millions of views because kids are open to the idea and primed for it. So, Sir Isaac Newton, recent scholars have stressed, arrived at many of the fundamental truths of modern physics through an intense study of alchemy, a mystical way of thinking supposedly discredited by the advanced scientific thought of our day. So a lot of people don't like talking about Newton anymore because he was a wackadoo alchemist that believed unscientific things, that you put a crow's foot with a piece of lead and you mix it and say the right chant, boom, gold.
Or heck, even, we can still, Chance and I can pretty quickly turn some of even the mainstream thoughts, our theories on them head too, right? It's the Tenenbaum, what's his first name?
Stan Tenen.
Stan Tenen, oh yeah, Stan Tenen and his whole theory about, the apple's significance and, a bunch of, Jewish Kabbalion sort of mysticism stuff. Very interesting, but yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack. But yeah, we can quickly.
And yes, Stan Tenen's a guy that talks about why the alphabet is in the order that it is and why it's shaped like it is, and it comes from Old Phoenician and ancient Hebrew stuff, and he's coming from very traditional Jewish background. He talks about how the letter for A in Hebrew makes a certain shape, and that that's the same shape that you hold an apple in, and a apple. And the apple had
a lot of the way that the letters were constructed. You could Italians and sort of, they say that Italian Jewish people kind of do a lot of talking with their hands, and so it's almost like enunciating with the hands at the same time. But there's mathematical toroidal properties and latent
and
inside it all.
The apple is the symbol of knowledge,
right?
And the Book of Genesis. And so, what is it that Newton figures out gravity with? It's the fruit of knowledge. And so, at some point, Newton's apple fruit of knowledge is all these alchemical books, because if you're not playing around with a bunch of proto-chemistry, how the heck are you going to come up with chemistry and physics? It's as simple as that. You got to go explore. And also, maybe if people have been exploring for long enough, they have a bunch of cool codified, formalized ways of coming up with knowledge in that exploration. And yeah, Newton was privy to that. Bacon was privy to that. John Dee was privy to that. And because of that, their theories, their works, have all sorts of cool stuff in it. And so, yet for a long time, the Newtonian establishment refused to consider or acknowledge the fact that Newton was an alchemist. There's a lesson here, perhaps, for disputants on both sides of the authorship question. So that's just a very easy example that Chandler pulled out of his hat from maybe a similar time. says, look, everybody thought this one way of him, but the documentation was scant, but it sort of suggested that it was one way, and that, like, once that was sort of proven with more evidence, it was impossible not to see it when you were reading Newton, when you were thinking about Newton, when you were studying Newton, and it was impossible not to see that influence. And so at some point, we need to do the same thing with Shakespeare, maybe quite literally also with alchemy. Maybe that, that opened up Newton studies, like maybe let's just do that with Shakespeare. And if so, like, let's get the Sidney D circle going. Let's get Ed Dyer in the house. Let's get Edward Kelly. Let's get all the wacky guys.
The Areopagus lads.
Yeah, there you go. Falk Greville, the boys, and the girl.
Yeah.
Mary's there too, and maybe more. All right, so that's by David Chandler at Kyoto University. I don't know if David Chandler's still around, still working, or still writing, or still alive, but go read this. If you are anybody that is interested in the Shakespeare authorship question, please go read this essay. I wish I did it way better justice in this video. I tried to skim through and end up paraphrasing more than reading, and when I did read, it wasn't always the quote I wanted. So please go read it on your own. But David Chandler clearly is not going to take a side in this. He's definitely not an apologist towards one side or the other. If you think that David Chandler is an apologist towards one side or the other, please let me know why in the comments. But I think you're wrong. I don't think David Chandler is a Stratfordian, but clearly David Chandler is also not an Oxfordian or Baconian. I would assume that David Chandler is an agnostic Shakespeare doubter. Feels like the conversation needs to be had more genuinely, openly to get anywhere. And, thankfully things like YouTube have popped up since David Chandler wrote this. And so it's cool to be on here. It's cool to have all these discussions. It's been super exciting in our recent videos to pop onto the comment board and see 8 new comments, 10 new comments, and some of them are up to like 40-something comments. Like, that's awesome, guys. Keep it coming. Seeing a lot of different ideas out there. Like, if you just come onto our comment board, you'll see some people are out there pitching, Oxford. There's some Stratfordians coming on the comment board. There's some people saying wacky things like Walter Raleigh. Brady and I are over here pitching Sidney and Dyer. A lot of Baconians are showing up. Mr. Abzu's coming in saying, look, I don't know exactly who's writing Shakespeare. I think it's probably a lot of different dramatists, but Ben Jonson's wrapped up in the whole thing. We need to talk about Ben Jonson. Of course, a lot of Marlovians coming in. At some point, love all the diversity of discussion, and this giant dialectic, it's awesome that we can have it on YouTube, and this is sort of what's partly been missing for David Chandler, but we need to start...
we need to hold what he says is we need to have a sort of what he called it, the Shakespeare in the feudal era, whatever, right? But or like our good buddy Anderson Savannah said about having our we can have it a cyber annual Shakespeare authorship circle conference, right? But yeah, a healthy sort of rebuttal, respectful, debuttable, exactly what Chandler says about not everyone coming with the assumption that they are right and that everyone else is wrong. Like, that's not how a scientist is supposed to work. That's not what all these Royal Society pre-founder dudes were sort of expounding upon, that we think that we're all sort of marching, and sort of heralding all the time, but yet we've all got our egos wrapped into the whole thing, right?
So I don't know, just pitching out a seminar idea here on the spot off the top of my head, like Shakespeare and the role of the Dutch War. Shakespeare and the Essex Circle. Let's see, Shakespeare and the phenomenon of publishing plays. Shakespeare and the pamphlet wars. Shakespeare and the War of the Theaters. Like, any of these could totally work for all of us to come in with our different hypotheses or theoretical frameworks to try and answer things about those discussions and to give our sort of viewpoints of those discussions. And people that are neutral and agnostic can hear all those different viewpoints and say, oh, I think that one helps me read more into this Shakespeare play. Or I think that one opened up a sonnet for me. Or, wow, I didn't even think about that with that Marlowe play. But we're not getting that right now. All we're getting is, whoa, that's De Vere. Whoa, that's Bacon. And that's it. Yeah, let's develop it further. Let's get it further, because if not, this Shakespeare authorship question's going to be permanently stuck at this fringe level. And if that happens, I worry that Shakespeare himself will be pushed out into the sort of highfalutin, artsy academic world that is not touched by, the mainstream majority of the populace.
Yeah, much like people, and I'm certain this time period, start to abandon stuff like Seneca and Virgil and all this sort of stuff, I see the same reflection, like, this what do they call it? Linguistic registry is just too hard for us to grab onto. It's too archaic, and so we'll put it up, we'll put it up on the shelf. Let's not, forget and pay, remember that it's there.
Still got my copy of the Aeneid on the shelf. I don't touch it, but
Yeah.
it's up there.
Right.
Let me put Shakespeare right next to it, and it's where it's going, right next to the Aeneid, the Bible,
And Homer and
Chaucer, and other stuff that you put on your shelf and don't read. There's an argument that none of those things should be treated like that, but I think more so for Elizabethan literature than any of them. They're the closest, they're the most impactful on our language and culture, and honest to God, this is my own personal opinion, they're freaking better. Elizabethan drama and poetry is better than Chaucer. I'm saying it. Tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. It's better than Virgil. And to be fair, I have read Virgil in the Latin, but to be fair, I don't read Sophocles in his ancient Greek tongue, so, but that said, Shakespeare's better than Sophocles.
Would you say it's better than stuff like The Green Knight?
Yeah, assuredly, Macbeth is always better than Sir Gawain in The Green Knight. I don't know that I would say that Sir Gawain in The Green Knight's always better than Beowulf. I don't know that I would say that Beowulf's always better than Virgil, so it's not just like this historical thing where things are always better than the older thing. That's a modern idea.
Yeah, I definitely made fun of the sagas last episode. It's like, it's kind of goofy, and maybe some of that context is lost, and
It's a modern idea to look back and say, oh, they're before us, so they're more archaic, they're worse. But guess where that idea starts, guys? Shakespeare, the Elizabethan times. It's because they have these things popping up, and it's because there are people like Philip Sidney that have a freaking inferiority complex about it. That's like, dude, I'm so tired of going to Italy, France, and reading Latin, reading Italian, reading French, reading freaking German and Norse and God knows what else, and they can all write better than we can. We got one guy, and his name's Chaucer, and he's 200 years old. What is going on? We've got to do better. And I'm paraphrasing Philip Sidney. I think that about wraps it up, Brady. Any other last comments we want to roll with here?
No, I think that leaves us in a pretty good spot. I think we're still kind of trickling out the trailer or breadcrumbs for our big mic drop.
Yeah, our big reveal video.
That I think that hopefully for Baconians and Oxfordians would be that sort of resounding sort of what did you say earlier? You can't look away from it. It's apparent, right?
Right.
And I think it should just. I would think that it just tied in so many things before, because we dropped our Sydney video. Oh, I'm sorry. We dropped it a few months ago. I want to say we recorded it last year. Actually, recorded back in November. But it was only recently that we started to find even more and more, but which is not good if you're sort of on the Philip Sidney hype train, if you're trying to remain unbiased. But it is sort of comforting at the same time to sort of be like, whoa, this should set some red flags for some people. This should be really provocative. This should sort of, and it doesn't, not everyone, we're not kicking people out of the party. It really shouldn't be that, just because we find some connection doesn't mean that DeVere has nothing to do with it or Bacon has nothing to do with it, because as we said at the top of the episode, Cecil is sort of also a main focal point. All these people connect here. There is a lot of personal connections. People's daughters marry each other's sons. It's all in the family, folks.
We showed in the last video with the sonnets that, Sidney writes a response poem to DeVere's little poem, and we didn't show the other two response poems, but there are two more responses by ignoto, which means anonymous, but
And wouldn't you say that both the DeVere and the Sidney poem are pretty equal caliber? You got DeVere kind of riffing off, posing a cool question, and here's Sidney coming back with here's what I would come back with. It's cool.
Yeah, DeVere had the cool idea from the start and set it up in this neat little sing-songy structure. Sidney came in and almost brushed it up, right? Made it even a little cooler and better and flipped it on its head. And at some point, and maybe this will be the last thing I want to talk about. Maybe we'll do a whole video on this. One thing I want to talk about that Chandler never brings up specifically, but it is a huge rift between Oxfordians and Stratfordians, and that is the timeline of Shakespeare. If you are a Stratfordian, or pretty much any other person other than Oxfordian, you think that Shakespeare starts out in the early 1590s and goes up to the 16 teens, and then it gets published in the 1620s. When exactly each play is played or first written, or if it gets published in quartos and that kind of thing. Those are all up for grabs, but the idea is that generally speaking, the earliest plays being written as they get published, at least like Henry VI, those are happening in the early 90s, as we sort of see in the Henslow Diary. And if you're Baconian or Marlovian, that's totally the same timeline. But if you're an Oxfordian, that timeline, that's not right. Oxfordians say all of the plays just about are written in the 80s, especially things like Macbeth and Hamlet and Henry V and Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet, and you just name
all
it.
those famous ones that...
Yeah, all those famous ones that sell a lot of copies and get talked about.
Yeah, the ones that got Leonardo DiCaprio in them.
Those are the ones that they date to the 1580s, and I don't technically disagree with them, but here's what I'm getting at. The way that a lot of them do it, especially like Ramon Jimenez, he's like one of the best. He goes in and he'll find a line in Macbeth, and it's like, that line is surmised by the Stratfordian Guard to be about the gunpowder plot, but then he'll show that is clearly much more about the Irish Rebellion of 1580 or 1581 or something like that. And it's conclusive. Like, Jimenez is totally right. He's totally right. And then Jimenez goes on and does that a few more times in Macbeth, and he does that a few more times in the other plays. And all right, boom. Oxford wrote all these in the 80s. No, that's stupid. That's really stupid. Oxford did write those in the 80s, but that doesn't mean that they weren't touched again from there on out. As we showed in the Henslow Diary, Hamlet and Lear are totally already around by the early 1590s, and they're not new. Presumably kind of old reruns. So clearly, there's a chance that Oxford's writing Lear and Hamlet and other plays in the 1580s. But if you Oxfordians out there mean to tell me that what I'm reading when I get a copy that comes out, edited from the folio, and I'm reading, Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, if you're saying that was originally written in 1580 something, you can go fly a kite, okay? Like, I'll just say it like that. It's a total disavowal and misunderstanding of the rest of the body of literature. You're totally looking at Shakespeare in isolation. Because read Hamlet, read Troilus and Cressida, read Julius Caesar, and tell me that there's not stylistic evidence that runs exactly like a bunch of other plays from that exact point in time. Even Stratfordians concede a lot of this, even when it's in conflict with their views. They will still concede because they can't argue with the stylistic evidence.
They'll just cop out and be like, oh, well, then he must have, worked him a little bit. Or
They'll make up something, like, at least they try and answer it. You Oxfordians out there, for the most part, just disavow that. Or
genius just has to be a little bigger than I guess to somehow encapsulate.
To be fair, I've heard this also that Oxford originally wrote all those, but then that the 1590s, when you don't hear much about Oxford up into 1604, guess what he's doing? He's just reworking those. He's just reworking them until they're perfect and ready to publish in 1604, and so they get published in 1623. Like, you see the gap there, the 19-year gap between 1604 and 1623.
What's their connection that they try to make with, like, Ben Jonson's play with role and all that too?
It's hazy, it's nebulous. And so, like, at some point, even if you want to say that he's working up into 1604, plenty of people, and they've done good work, they've shown that there are things in Shakespeare plays that date beyond 1604. Whether or not you want to say that the original is written before that, like, what is finally printed has stuff that has been pinned post 1604. That is not up for debate. It's in there. So, like, what do you have to say about that? And then that's when you'll hear a few Oxfordians say, oh, it's Bacon. Bacon, is getting to touch up a few things. Or it's Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson touching up a few things, getting it printed out. But even that is not solo authorship theory, I want you to understand. But even that still doesn't fully kind of explicate the phenomenon. So I guess we will end it here. Please, Oxfordians, come in here and answer some of these questions. Pause it, go rewatch it, read through the transcripts, answer some of these questions, because Brady and I would love to just hop back on the Oxford train. We that's what got us here, but those questions I don't think can be answered by Oxford alone. And if not Oxford alone, who else? Clearly Bacon, Neville, Mary Sidney, but even so, like, once again, you're going to have to understand how individual experience shapes literary works. And you're not going to be able to do that with Oxford or Bacon or Mary Sidney. They don't have enough literary output. They didn't actually do that. Not until another guy already did it, and they still didn't do it as much as him. Who's the guy that already did it? It's Philip Sidney. Maybe this is all starting to connect, maybe. But like, none of this Shakespeare phenomenon can even happen without Philip Sidney. Whether or not you think that means he's Shakespeare, you still got to go start studying him. Oh wait, let's see. That's about it. Gonna come at you very soon with our big hype train. Gonna talk about John Dee. But maybe before then we'll do one more sleuthing the sonnets videos. There's definitely way more sonnets to dive into, and honestly, not just Shakespeare. I'm reading a book right now called The Five Authors of the Sonnets by H.T.S. Forrest from exactly 100 years ago in 1923. And he's actually an Orthodox Stratfordian scholar, and he thinks Shakespeare is Shakespeare. But as he reads through the sonnets, he does not think that they are unified in tone, in theme, or in style. And so because of that, or even quality, because of that, he has to start to pick apart and see if he can find any patterns. And lo and behold, it seems like there's 4 with an alternating 5th, constantly all kind of in a contest with each other to write over the same themes for a few sets of sonnets, and then change to a new theme for a few sets of sonnets, and change to a new theme for a few sets of sonnets. And it's pretty convincing, and I hope it's very connected to, let's see, I think Roughneck left me a comment that I need to check out Roche's, the English sonnet sequence. And hopefully that will also maybe help me to parse apart what H.T.S. Forrest is saying. And there's some other Orthodox Stratfordians that do similar things. I think J.M. Robertson has a book about it as well that I hope to hop into. So yeah, maybe come at you with some sonnets, but also going to come at you with some John Dee very soon. Maybe even do a video over the Malcontents, since I've been reading that. But that's all food for thought. Let us know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sticking around. If you haven't watched any of our videos, this is the first one you're watching, go back. Start at video 1, where we start diving into the history of the Shakespeare authorship question. So even if you don't buy into our theories or don't give a hoot for our readings, go check out those videos, because those will give you a layout of what everybody has said up till now on this question, all the way back to 1856 or 7. So, yep. Thanks, guys. See y'all soon.
And we are approaching, I want to end on the note that we are approaching the 437th anniversary of Philip Sidney's death here on October 17th. And so that is 8 days away from here. So maybe we'll either drop the Big Bomb episode, or maybe we'll try to host a live episode, or a live stream, because it'd be kind of fun to talk to the folks real time, and maybe answer some questions or something like that. But also have it celestially aligned to our patron candidate here here on Apocalypsis. So yeah, keep your eyes open. I'll probably make that as soon as possible if it's happening or not. But yeah, thanks for, as always, sticking around towards the end and dropping those knowledge bomb comments. And as always, nullius in verba.